Tantra Illuminated with Dr. Christopher Wallace is a journey through the depths of the human experience, as viewed through the lens of the tradition called non-dual Shaiva Tantra. This multi-format podcast delves into the fascinating world of Classical Tantra and its intersections with philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, human development, and the broader world of spirituality. This week's episode is a conversation, and the title is an oversimplification. This is a deep dive conversation into many topics, but the central one is a kind of comparison of the teachings of non-dual Shaiva Tantra with those of Dzogchen. Since my guest in this episode is quite a renowned expert in Dzogchen, he takes the lead in this conversation. I'm speaking with Acharya Malcolm Smith. He has been a student of Dzogchen teachings since 1992. His main teachers are Chogyal Namkhai Norbu, Kunzang Dechen Lingpa, and Taklung Tsechul Rinpoche, all sadly passed away now. He is a veteran of a traditional 3-year solitary Tibetan Buddhist retreat, a published translator of Tibetan Buddhist texts, and he was awarded the degree of Acharya by the Shakya Institute in 2004. His books include Buddhahood in This Life and The Self-Arisen Vidya Tantra, among many others. Some parts of our conversation may be difficult to understand if you don't have a background in Buddhism, but this podcast has the purpose to offer content for beginners and for advanced practitioners and students of these traditions. I hope you enjoy this deep dive. I'm here with Malcolm Smith, who does not specifically care for titles, he told me before we started recording, but has been awarded the title Acharya as well as the title Lama by his teachers. So welcome. Glad to have you on the podcast.
Okay, it's nice to be here, Harish, or Christopher, depending upon which you like. Swami or Guru.
No, not Swami or Guru. So my understanding is that you are extremely well studied in the Tibetan Buddhist lineages that you have participated in and been initiated into. You read Tibetan proficiently, you translate, you write books, and you came to be drawn more and more over time to Dzogchen teachings. Mm-hmm. Could you share with us about your journey and you know how you ended up with the view that you now have, if it's not too long a tale to tell, as opposed to gravitating to some other area of Buddhism?
Well, it's pretty simple. I started out as an industrial musician in the early 1980s, pretty much focused on throbbing gristle and psychic TV, and then became a member of the Temple of Psychic Youth, started reading a bunch of Aleister Crowley, then became interested in reading what influences were influencing Crowley. About the same time, this is around 1984, at that time, I sort of, 1984, early 1985, I encountered Nagarjuna. And reading Nagarjuna stopped me just dead in my tracks. And then because, I was still interested in sort of tantric stuff and so on and so forth, I could never really get into the Western esoteric tradition because it was too theistic for my taste. All this Yahweh and Elohim and so on and so forth I just couldn't relate to it. So I began, but I read a lot of things, everything that was pretty much available on, Hinduism in the 1980s and Buddhism, which at that point was not very much, uh, Confucianism, Taoism. I was in my mid 20s, to my sort of early 20s to mid 20s. I was very much reading a lot. Took some courses at Harvard Extension on history and how to write. The usual sort of remedial education that we have to go through in the United States to get through college because high schools are so bad here. And then I went to work. One of the most fortunate things that happened to me is that I went to work at this bookstore on Newbury Street called Trident Booksellers. And the owner was a Buddhist, and he had a huge selection of Buddhist books, but not just Buddhist books, also Hindu books. And I was selling books there. So I had to sell a lot of You Can Heal Your Life by Louise Hay, Course in Miracles, et cetera. Many, but he had a huge selection of Buddhist books. So I had this library available to me all the time. It's actually the place where I first ran into my primary teacher's first published, first easily available book, Crystal in the Way of Light. So, I worked there for a number of years, and also at the same time, I had become very interested in the Vajra Tantra, which at that point had been an English translation by David Snellgrove for many, many years. So I was very interested in that cycle of teachings, and Sakya Trizin, His Holiness Sakya Trizin, the older one, he's about 80 now. He was going to be in Boston, and then I saw this poster that said he teaches in English. So I thought that was interesting, and I thought we would go. And I'd already been to Japan and had this kind of aesthetic experience on yogāsana and decided that I was a Buddhist. But I didn't really actually have much idea of what that meant. Oh, and to preface this, when I was 16, I did spend a weekend session at the Daibozatsu Zendo as part of a private alternative school that I'd gone to after I'd gotten kicked out of my regular high school. So, and people should know I never graduated from any official program. I have a degree in Tibetan medicine from Shangsheng Institute, but that's my only formal degree. Then I met His Holiness and started studying. And at that point, I was very interested in Abhidharma, and he had appointed a young Lama to come here and head up the Cambridge Center, and Lama Mikmar Satan, who's now the Buddhist chaplain of Harvard. We're still quite close. And I asked him to teach Abhidharma. And so he did. After he taught this one text by Sakya Pandita, which is kind of, there's a very famous text by Maitreya Nath called the Mahayana Sutra Alankara, which is kind of presents a graded path of Mahayana. So after Lama Mikmar finished teaching that, he started teaching Abhidharma. And from him, I learned Abhidharma, stages and paths literature, Madhyamaka, and in about 1993, late 1993, I did a 3-year retreat. And that's a whole different story. We don't really have time to go into it. But I'd already met Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche. So when I was in my 3-year retreat, I spent a lot of time practicing the creation and completion stages of the Vajra system called Lamdre, Palamarga system. And but I was also doing translations while, sort of between sadhana sessions. And
can I just jump in because the listeners will be interested? This is a 3-year silent, except for speaking with your Lama solo retreat.
It was solo, but the first 2 years were kind of open, which is the case that people would come and go. Sometimes people would come to do retreats themselves, and I was able to communicate a bit with people. Because I was mostly working on preliminary practices. The last year and a half was completely silent. I mean, silent in the sense I didn't talk to anybody.
And how much sadhana a day are you doing in this kind of retreat?
Generally speaking, 8 to 10 hours a day.
Yeah, impressive.
Well, I mean, I had a lot of mantras to get through. The Vajra mantra is about 144 syllables. The root mantra is about 144 syllables long, and you have to recite 400,000 of them.
Wow.
And that doesn't count the essence mantra and the near essence mantra and the mantra of the mothers, and then the mantras of all the retinue, dakinis. So it's a lot of mantras.
Yeah.
And And prior to that, at the beginning of my retreat, I'd done a 48-day strict retreat of Vajrakilaya, which is like 1,000,000 mantras. So, there was a lot of mantras were counted.
Yeah. And you said your first Dzogchen teacher was Namkai Norbu, is that right?
Yeah. Yep. So he wasn't the first person I actually had heard some teachings about Dzogchen from. I had gone with a friend of mine to San Francisco to receive an empowerment called the Guyagarbha. And there's a commentary of the Guyagarbha by Rongzom Choki Pandita. But chapter 13 of the Guyagarbha is considered to be one of the sort of classical sources for the idea of the great perfection. Some modern text critical scholars have this idea that somehow all of Dzogchen emerged from Mahayoga. I don't agree with this idea at all, personally. And the reason I don't agree with this idea is that there's a text written by, I'm not really sure if he lived in the 8th century or the late 9th century. My gut is that he lived in the late 9th century, and he was a part of what we call the Buddhajnana tradition of Goya Samaj. And in this text that he wrote, he identifies Sri Singha as being part of a group of Indians, scholars and practitioners, who rejected this idea that you needed to practice the creation stage at all. This is visualizing yourself as a deity and so on and so forth. And you just needed to focus on what we call the completion stage, which is resting in suchness, resting in the nature of mind or whatever you want to call it. But you needed to just go directly to that. And of course, the reason why this controversy emerged is because there were some people that saying you actually only achieve Buddhahood through meditating upon yourself in the form of a deity, meditating on your 5 aggregates, sort of your physical aggregate, etc., as this sort of mandala of 5 Buddhas and their consorts. And then, so there's this kind of 2 extremes. And then Manjushri Kirti, he was arguing that you had to have a balanced practice of both, which is the standard Tibetan Buddhist idea, that you have the creation stage, which you use to purify your conceptuality. And then you have the completion stage, which is to break your attachment to having a mind free of conceptuality, having a mind which is focused on purity. So this is generally speaking the reason for the 2 stages. One to purify your sort of afflictive relationship with the world. The idea being, of course, is that if you visualize everything as a Buddha field and you're a Buddha and all the sentient beings you see are effectively Buddhas, you're all part of this mandala. To use the metaphor which is common in this tradition in both Dzogchen and sort of standard Vajrayana, if you arrive on an island of gold, you won't choose a rock over a leaf or a leaf over, it's all gold. So this is the idea of the creation stage. And then the completion stage is meant to break your attachment to that. So what Sri Singha's faction is arguing, that this preliminary practice of having to go through this sort of conceptual elaboration of imagining everything wherever you are as a pure Buddha dimension is unnecessary. You want to go directly into a nirvikalpa samadhi without passing go.
But the way you've described the 2 stages is how I'm familiar with them as well, is the second stage breaks your attachment to the purity, this sort of luminous purity of mind that you achieved in the first stage, if you did it right. So how could, in his argument, how could you go straight to the second stage when you haven't developed that purity of mind?
Yeah. So, okay. So that is true. But what the Sri Singha is basically arguing, and this underlines most of Dzogchen points of view, is that this purity that you're developing is conceptual. And while it is certainly true that there's a kind of homeopathic component to what let's call normative Vajrayana, This homeopathic this homeopathic idea is actually explicitly rejected in Dzogchen. In other words, in Dzogchen, we're arguing that you will never cure concepts with more concepts. Ever. It's impossible. So therefore, this whole metaphor that you find in the Vajra Tantra about, healing fire with fire and pulling water out of your ear with water, in Dzogchen, this is completely rejected. Because all of this is basically considered to be on the level of mind and intellectual analysis. And so in Dzogchen, really the heart of Dzogchen, there's a couple of things that we should address here. Number one, are the goals of standard, and now I don't know about Hinduism at all, really, because I've studied it tangentially, but mostly from a polemical point of view. And in Tibetan Buddhism, we study a lot of Hindu tenet systems, but mostly to show where they're wrong. That's our main goal. And not only do we study Hindu tenet systems to show where they're wrong, but we also study Buddhist tenet systems to show where they're wrong. And that's a kind of a particular Madhyamaka point of view. That's why Madhyamaka is considered to be the apogee of sort of normative Buddhist philosophical systems. Although there's some dissent about this in Tibet. There's the school called Other Emptiness, but it's my opinion, the opinion of many centuries of Tibetan Buddhist scholars before me. They just simply don't understand the Yogacara school correctly and they don't get it. And actually, it's very interesting. Dzogchen also completely rejects Yogacara, and there's many technical reasons for why this is so, which we can't go into. But there's like an attempt these days amongst modern scholars to kind of renovate or restore Yogacara to like some kind of parity with Madhyamaka. And, for those of us who are basically have drunk the Madhyamaka Kool-Aid, we just don't buy it. And Dzogchen is pretty much, if you read Longchenpa, he pretty much explicitly states that the view of Dzogchen intellectually is the same as Prasangika Madhyamaka. So, but let's get back to the main point. In here, we have to understand that the goal of all Buddhist schools, including Dzogchen, is what we call freedom or liberation and omniscience. So you have to ask the question, liberation from what? Now, these days, a lot of people have very sentimental notions of what awakening is. They tend to want to ascribe to awakening positive qualities like bliss and ecstasy, joy, these kinds of sort of positive emotions. This is why sometimes, sort of a little bit derogatorily, with sort of like yoga practitioners, we say, well, Hindus are happier because, they're bliss bunnies. They're all just like, happy, joyful, Namah Shivaya, everything is Shiva. This is fantastic, wonderful, and we're kind of like, Buddhists are a little dour. We're like, yes, no, everything is suffering. There is a cause, etc. There's not, everything isn't Shiva. Everything is actually pretty much miserable. But then we ask the question, why? The question why is that we have afflictions, and these afflictions drive our rebirth. And that rebirth is considered to be suffering. And so Dzogchen, like every other Buddhist tradition, takes this as the fundamental starting point. We are afflicted, therefore we engage in actions, karma, and the result of those actions, the result of those karma phala, is suffering. And so therefore the standpoint of Dzogchen is that you need to eliminate afflictions in order to eliminate rebirth in toto. Because from a Dzogchen point of view, rebirth that's the aim of, at least for yourself personally, is to cease taking rebirth in samsara, to put an end to transmigration, at least to sort of uncontrolled transmigration. That's not to say that if you become a Buddha that you cease benefiting sentient beings, that all of a sudden that the energy of your mind stream blips out into a cessation, like a total cessation. That would be nihilism from a Madhyamaka point of view. But the idea that we're going to continue in samsara in an uncontrolled way, where we're cycling through, Deva realms down to hell realms and back up again, like a wasp in a jar, this we want to end. So then the second goal is the goal for others. Well, there's the two kinds of omniscience. There's the omniscience of how everything actually is, and then there's the omniscience that knows. The way it's phrased in Tibetan, it's a little funny, but basically what it means to know all the extent of all that there is, and that simply means that you have knowledge of all liberative paths that you are capable of sharing with others. So you yourself know the actual nature of all phenomenon, including your own personal phenomenon, and you know how to lead other people through all means to that knowledge. And that's it. So in this way, Dzogchen is very standard. It's very normative. And a lot of people, they get involved with Dzogchen because they have I think one of the things that causes people some confusion between Dzogchen and the Shiva Shakti paradigm that we find in Hinduism is that we also have this idea of Samantabhadra and Samantabhadri. Now, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but if I understand correctly through my limited readings of sort of Hindu material, the Shiva Shakti paradigm is meant to be cosmological and in some extent to explain how the universe comes about and how we make errors and don't understand our real nature as Shiva and Shakti, which is a positive phenomenon, which is ontologically real. That's my limited understanding.
Yes, it depends which lineage you're looking at. That summary wouldn't be embraced across all Shaiva tantric lineages.
Okay, so to the extent that which Shaiva tantric lineages do not embrace this as being a cosmological, ontological narrative?
Well, primarily the Krama, which is one of the little known lineages of Shaivism. I mean, it's Shakta Shaiva, right? It's a lineage that has Kali as the ultimate divinity, but when they go to describe Kali, they say, well, truly, she can't be described. She's not even a she.
Mm-hmm.
That in fact, we don't even say that there is an existence that needs to be explained. Our ultimate doctrine is beyond existence and non-existence.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't posit or refute either of those. But there is this metaphor of the goddess, and in the Krama lineage, Shiva has just fallen away. There's no polarity. There's no two-ness at all. They want to avoid that, and they just describe Kali as, in her ultimate nature, as in paradoxical language, like the radiant darkness, the resounding silence, and the perfectly full emptiness. And the very fact that the mind can't understand what those phrases points to is indeed the point, right? So we see there in the Krama, something that is unfamiliar, even alien to those who think they know Kashmir Shaivism, let alone Hinduism. But here we are in the outer fringes, as it were, of Shaiva doctrine, and yet the Krama lineage for a time was very, very robust. It was flourishing in Kashmir. It was flourishing in Nepal and in other areas closely adjacent to the Buddhist tantric traditions where they flourished. Oh, including Udayana. The Krama flourished in Udayana, which of course you know. So that there, we get a different and the diversity of lineages in tantric Shaivism or Shakta Shaivism is really greater than most people have appreciated, understandably, because the published sources are not adequately nuanced to what you really find in the scriptural corpus and its commentaries. Yeah.
What is the point? So, how do these Krama lineages describe sort of cosmology, etc.? How do they? So one of the important points of Dzogchen teachings is that most Buddhist teachings do not provide an account of how delusion begins. They basically use the metaphor you find in the sutra, if you have an arrow stuck in your eye, your first question is how do you get the arrow out, not how did the arrow get there. But Dzogchen basically has this point of view if you don't understand very precisely how delusion occurs, then you cannot reverse delusion. What is the point of view of Krama about this? And is delusion even a problem in Krama?
Well, that's an interesting question because in the Krama sources, they never say that anything is wrong or is not as it should be, but they do describe how we fall into delusion and how to be free from it without ever suggesting that we should do anything or not do anything. So, and the Krama sources are not too interested in cosmology. They don't discuss the tattvas. They don't get into categorical lists like that. But briefly, the mechanism of delusion in the Krama is that, consciousness by its very nature illuminates objects of experience, and to illuminate them is to manifest them. There's no meaningful difference here. It's not objects waiting to be illuminated by consciousness sitting in the darkness. No, illumination is manifestation. And once there are objects of experience, and they're not ultimately really objects, but they appear to be, then we become fascinated by them, and we sort of forget ourselves, or we forget even that we are consciousness, right? And we just become enamored of the object. We sort of fall into the object, and the object, of course, can be a self-image. It can be a sensual object. It could be anything. And then there's a moment of coming back to yourself, as it were, where you cognize yourself as a knower of an object, and then you make a judgment about that cognition. I like this object. I don't like this object. This is good. This is bad, whatever. And then you reify the cognition, and that is the crux of the problem, that in that reversion from object to back to subject, we have an opportunity for awakening, for lack of a better word, for realization. And most people, of course, miss that opportunity. They just cognize themselves as a subject knowing an object and make a judgment about both object and subject and reify that judgment and then cling to it. And in fact, the opportunity is, to realize, consciousness is experiencing itself this way as the so-called object, and it is not actually colored by the object. It never was, and there is no subject-object dichotomy. There never was. It's just consciousness vibrating in this particular way with this particular character. And that's the nature of consciousness. It can manifest any sort of object for itself to experience, and then it can reify or not, but the reification is a mistake that causes suffering. And so we have these tools, the Krama lineage says we have these specific practices, often called mudras, which doesn't mean physical gestures or postures. I think the same for you, but a kind of attitude of how to translate it is problematic, but an attitude that you take, or a perspective that you cultivate to help you see the way things are, instead of this particular delusional trap. And that includes contemplation of impermanence, and that includes contemplation of consciousness's capacity to digest and devour any experience whatsoever without alteration to itself, and so on and so forth. So that's my brief description of that which kind of takes up most of the space in these Krama sources that analyze the questions that you're raising. And I would imagine, but perhaps I'm wrong, but I would imagine some of this anyway dovetails or parallels some of what you find in Dzogchen and Mahamudra sources.
Not so much Mahamudra sources. It's Mahamudra sources, generally speaking, they mostly write, okay, so all the Mahamudra dohas all write from the point of view of the result. So all the Mahamudra dohas, for the most part, are expressions of some Indian siddha who's experienced the result and written about how they have that experience. And oftentimes, like for example, in Virupa, they can be very dismissive of the previous methods that they used to achieve their realization. You know, like Virupa has one doha. It's good. The Sakyas call it the lion doha, but in the Tenjur it's called doha kosha. Anyway, in his sort of in the couplets that he gives us, in one place he basically says that some people are tortured by empowerment rites. Some people are tortured by consuming piss and shit. Some people are tortured by shouting hung and pet, et cetera, going through like the whole list of like standard Vajrayana practices, and says all of these people are doing this and all of them are deluded. But what interests me most is here, when you're talking about krama, is there in these krama lineages, I mean, I know you said that they describe ultimate reality as being beyond extremes, but saying that something is beyond extremes doesn't necessarily mean that you're negating anything. So, for example, of course, in Madhyamaka, we also say that reality is beyond the four extremes, but we also point out, since nothing exists by way of the four extremes, you also can't establish the ultimate. That is to say that and Dzogchen definitely takes this point of view in declaring that even the ultimate state of Buddhahood is illusory. One thing that makes people uncomfortable in Tibet about Dzogchen is that Dzogchen basically says that everything is completely illusory from beginning to end. And it's only the teaching of Dzogchen that actually explains this fully, that even Buddhahood is completely illusory, that ultimate truth is not established. There's no ultimate to establish separate from the relative. If relative truth isn't established, ultimate truth is not. Actually, Nagarjuna says this too. Nagarjuna, switching this into like compounded and uncompounded, Samskrita and Asamskrita. Nagarjuna writes in the Mula Madhyamika Karkas, he says, if arising, abiding, and perishing are not established, the compounded is not established. And if the compounded is not established, how can the uncompounded be established? And this actually eliminates and of course the two truths, at least depends on who you follow. But if you follow classical Madhyamaka according to the Indian model, then the Chandrakirti's definition of the two satyas, the two truths are that they are objects of perceptions. What we call Paramarth Satya is the object of a veridical perception. And what we're calling Samvirti Satya is the object of a false perception. So even though they say object, the key point is whether the perception is correct or not. And so that's why Dzogchen is considered to be, philosophically similar with Prasanga Madhyamaka, because for Prasanga Madhyamikas, any perception which imputes anything other than just the mere appearance of what's in front of you as a direct perception, any imputation of essence, identity, characteristics, so on and so forth, that's automatically going to be functionally false, because that doesn't correspond with how things actually are. And I don't know how krama lineages handle this, because I don't know nothing about them actually.
Yeah, I mean, if back in the day you read Kashmir Shaiva sources, Swami Lakshmanju and so on, there are these little, they touch on krama teachings a little bit here and there in Jayadeva Singh and in Lakshmanju's writings and teachings, but they don't get into it ever really at all. So it's not a surprise that not only you, but most people don't know much about the krama people who are reading in English. I mean, the
Mhm.
tantric scholars these days are very interested in the krama, and there's a bunch of research happening. But to come to your question, the krama doesn't seem to argue that anything is established, but it does negate it does negate the arguments of those who say this or that. For example, consciousness is utterly transcendent. It transcends everything that we could speak of or see or touch or taste or whatever. And there are those who say consciousness is utterly immanent. It is embodied as all sense perceptions, all phenomena whatsoever. And Krama says, we refute both of those positions, right? So we take consciousness to be ultimately beyond uh, transcendent and immanent, and any other pairs of opposites of any significance that you care to name. So the
Mhm.
Krama sources are very interested in saying, beyond this and that, where this and that are seen as opposites. For example, nirvikalpa and savikalpa, right?
Mhm.
We say, oh no, the ultimate is not attainable through nirvikalpa, and it is not instantiated, in thought forms any more than it's instantiated in anything else.
I see.
Yeah.
And so the question then comes is, if there's an so in Crom, if there's an account of delusion, then they must be concerned with the problem of rebirth and suffering.
Well, they don't speak of it in those terms. Maybe they were, right? But there's a lot of missing material as well, a lot of lost chroma texts. But
Hmm.
what they speak of is they do speak of liberation, and we
Hmm.
can take liberation to be liberation from the cycle of samsara. But they don't generally talk about rebirth as the issue. I mean, they will say samsara is not the cycle of samsara is not where you want to be, but
Hmm.
the question is, are they taking samsara to mean birth and death and rebirth and redeath, or are they taking samsara to be this cycle of suffering in which we're bound in any given life that I was just beginning to sort of describe earlier? This
Hmm.
cycle, this of identification and clinging and inability to accept impermanence and grasping after essence. By the way, the Krama also agrees with Buddhism that all entities and states of mind are essence-less.
Hmm.
Nothing possesses an essence of its own. So, grasping after an apparent essence to yourself or anything else is a cause of suffering. And you can be free from all that, or you can keep suffering if you want. So, um, yeah, that's what I could say about it briefly. A lot
Hmm.
of a lot of subjects are sort of left untouched in Krama sources, and we people reading those sources wonder how much should we assume from other lineages, or how much should we not assume, because the Krama does appear to be a kind of unique phenomenon emerging from Udayana around the same time, by the way, as Padmasambhava.
Hmm.
So, but you know,
8th century.
yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
I mean, you could almost say it's like it'd be easy to read some Krama passages and say, "Oh, this is Buddhist," but of
Hmm.
course, it's not. They never mention the Buddha or Bodhisattvas or any of that, so it's not. It's like a almost sui generis, and it will use some language from the rest of Shaiva non-dual philosophy, but it also wants to go beyond dual versus non-dual. As
Do
if
they?
you, yeah.
So they don't really. Uh-huh. So do they? Is there one of the interesting things that Patanjali said in his Yoga Sutras, and he's discussing liberation, different kinds of practitioners. He mentions that there are some practitioners, and I'm quite sure that he's referring to Buddhists, who never go beyond Prakrit. They mistake sort of the in Sankhya terms the sort of devolution back into sattva as being the actual goal, and thus they never really discover Purush, and they mistake sort of sattvic contemplation as being liberation and never transcend Prakriti.
Yeah, that's a tendentious statement, if ever there was one. The only implied criticism of Buddhism that we get in Krama sources, and it's only implied, and so it depends how you're reading it, is that those who have immersed in shunya, in shunyata, they have not realized the ultimate reality, because the ultimate reality is maha shunyata, also known as shunyati shunya, the void beyond the void, and the void beyond the void, emptiness beyond emptiness, is the emptiness that's perfectly full at the same time. It's the perfectly full emptiness. That is the ultimate, and the implication being that those Buddhists who kind of, regard the finish line to be shunyata, that they are penultimate.
That's interesting. There's a in this very long text called we're in the process of finishing editing. My partner and I. There's a chapter in there where it identifies the view which is beyond the great perfection, which and there's no Sanskrit for it, but it's the Tibetan is Tadang Drawa Yonsu Zokpa. Tadang Drawa means anta, so it's niranta, beyond any kind of extreme. And Yonsung Zokpa means completely full, meaning completely full of qualities in that sense. That basically the argument is that despite everything being completely free from extreme, nevertheless qualities manifest, but they're not ascribed any positive or negative ontological status. They're just reduced to the level of appearances. So you find this a lot in Tibetan, like in Dzogchen text. You have a lot of authors like Mipam who talk about Neluk and Nongluk, the way things are. So Neluk, I don't know if you know this, but Neluk can either be a translation of Tathata or Bhutata. Can be either. And then Nongluk, we don't have a Sanskrit equivalent for that. But Nongluk means is how things appear as opposed to how things are. And so a lot of these, particularly Dzogchen authors and some Madhyamaka authors in the non-Gelugpa tradition, they spend a lot of time trying to there's the way things are, and then there's the way things appear. And the way things appear doesn't correspond to the way things are. In the Dzogchen tradition, there's nothing actually to transform. This is one of the reasons why in Dzogchen we reject the creation stage. I mean, the creation stage is fine for some people. So there's a teacher, there's a very important teacher in the Dzogchen lineage called Manjushri Mitra. Manjushri Mitra was a Yogacara scholar, and he was Garb Dorje's, according to tradition and mythology, Garb Dorje's first human disciple, who went up to debate him in Odiyana when he was, some say when he was a young boy, but there's 3 different versions of Garb Dorje's biography. So the only thing in which all 3 different stories agree upon is that he was the child of a princess who became a nun and somehow got pregnant. And that's about the only place where these 3 stories sort of meet each other, in some places the princess is from a central Indian country, and a couple of other places are from in Odiyana. But then where Odiyana is, or the dimension of Odiyana is a little unclear, because then there's this island called Dhanakosha, which if you read in one, it's actually an island which is like off the coast of Pakistan. If you read in others, it should be somewhere up in the mountains, which, so we don't really know what the sort of range of, everybody says, sort of capital of Odiyana in Tibetan source called Dahena Talo. That we can pretty much put in the Swat Valley. No doubt.
Yeah.
No doubt. But what the actual extent, so in the Tibetan imagination, the Indian imagination, what the actual extent of that kingdom of Odian is a little ambiguous and vague. The best evidence we have for that is Xuanzang's travelogue.
Yeah, you mean the one from the early 13th century?
Oh no, no, not Orgenpa. Orgenpa did go there, but
Yeah,
he never made it. He went through Gilgit and wound up in the sort of Himalayan part of Odiyana.
right.
Then there's also Xuanzang, who is a 7th century Chinese pilgrim who traveled on foot all the way through there. And so he gives us our best account of what these sort of former Bactrian kingdom countries, Khotan, etc. He gives us our best account of what they were like and what people are practicing there. And when he gets to the country that he identifies as Odion, he says that the people there were very interested in Mantrayana practice and correct practice to corrupt form of Mahayana.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about now. And in my, well, in the academic school from which I come, we date the advent of real tantric practice in that region a little bit after that, probably. So,
Mm-hmm.
he could be, his reporting could be accurate. It could be just that, proper Tantra hadn't come to the region yet. Who knows? But for sure, it was a Buddhist kingdom that then became a Shaiva kingdom a couple centuries later, and tantric practice, both Buddhist and Shaiva and Shakta, flourishing there for some centuries. And a lot of scholars are working on this now, the significance of Udayana, meaning that relatively small kingdom in historical terms, not in mythical terms, the relatively small kingdom centered on the Swat Valley, which of course produced the greatest, some of the greatest luminaries of Tantric Buddhism and of Tantric Shakta Shaivism, like these Krama masters,
Mm-hmm.
derive from Udayana, also pronounced Odiyana. It's spelled different ways, of course.
Mm-hmm. That raises an interesting question. So, sort of, what is your take on the Vijnan Bhairav Tantra and its origins? So, which tradition is this associated with?
Well, yeah, I've worked on it a lot. I'm coming out with a translation of it. It is a bit mysterious, but it seems to not want to have any explicit sectarian identifiers. I mean, it uses the name of the goddess associated with the Trika lineage, so it's nominally considered a Kaula Trika text.
Mm-hmm.
But the text itself is not interested in any form of sectarianism, and my working hypothesis now is that it was compiled from oral teachings from siddhas and yoginis, these kinds of siddhas and yoginis, consort pairs that live in the hills and the mountains around Kashmir and between Kashmir and Swat Valley, and that they were giving these oral instructions on practices that include, ones that most people associate with Dzogchen and related Buddhist traditions, like sky gazing and stuff like that. And they give all these practices, and it's not it. People have assumed the text is by one author. I now believe, and there's some evidence in other texts to suggest that it's actually a compilation of oral teachings of siddhas and yoginis who probably did not identify in a sectarian manner, right? But who were part of this practice culture in
Mm-hmm.
which Buddhists and Shaktas and Shaivas and all sorts were practicing in the same region in proximity to each other, and that the scholarly types want to kind of impose the rigidities of doctrine that these practitioners seem to have not been particularly interested in. They were interested in kind of subitist teachings, sutras, and practical techniques that could bring about some
Mm-hmm.
breakthrough realization in very little time and stuff like that. And Vijnana Bhairava Tantra seems to be very much a part of that world that later gets assimilated to a sectarian tradition.
Question I have also is I was talking to Shaman Hatley once at a
Yeah.
conference in England at the Victoria at the Victoria and Albert Museum. There was supposed to be a conference on Hey Vajra that fell through because the man who was going to organize the conference passed away suddenly about a year later. But anyway, the question I asked him was as to the extent to which embryology is important in Indian tantras. And the reason why I ask is because embryology and sort of the structure of the human body and its anatomy is one of the overwhelmingly important features of Buddhist Tantra, including Dzogchen. He explained to me that from his point of view, it wasn't that important because, basically Hindu tantras were mainly concerned with realizing Godhead. And so therefore it wasn't like there wasn't this kind of sort of mechanistic focus on the mechanics of contemplation and samadhi. That was his point of view. What's your point of view?
Well, no, I I agree with him about embryology. That the Hindu, of course, we're referring to a period before the word Hindu was
Yes,
used as an indigenous term.
I'm using this. It's
Yes,
like Tibet doesn't really mean Tibet.
right. Okay, good.
Tibet
So
is only is like the provinces of Assam and U.
yeah,
Then you have Am and Amdo and Nari, but the actual B is really just the central region of Tibet.
yeah, exactly. So yeah, in quotes, these Hindu tantrics who are authoring the sources we have seem to regard chakras, for example, as either metaphysical things or aspects of the psyche that the subtle body can be understood
Mm-hmm.
as a fuller account of what we might call the human psyche. And or they didn't have an opinion about whether they were physical or metaphysical, but this the notion that or the kind of interest in physical anatomy that we find in some of the Buddhist sources seems to be almost totally absent for the
Mm-hmm.
Hindus, and maybe this is because they weren't doing any dissection and they weren't doing any sky burials either. So maybe they just didn't know, and so they didn't
I
concern
would say,
themselves.
that in like Chakrasamvara tantras, like uh, the Abhidhamma and some of the sort of Chakrasamvara tantras that are written as commentary tantras on the Laghusamvara, you find a great deal of anatomy, and that's not from Tibetan sources. It's true that I think that maybe the difference is that Buddhist tantrikas at that particular point in time in history were much more grounded in an Ayurvedic view of the body, and were much more grounded in trying to understand. So, like for example, in the Dzogchen tradition, it's basically stated that if you do not understand the formation of the body, you will not understand the formation of the nadis. If you don't understand the formation of the nadis, you will not understand the flow of the vayu. And if you don't understand the flow of the vayu, you will not understand how the bindus function in the body, which are considered to be the locus of consciousness within the human body. And so we have two kinds of, when we talk about the basis in Dzogchen, now we're talking about the sort of the interesting part of what Dzogchen is about and why we have a discussion of the formation of delusion. That I mentioned earlier in our conversation, that understanding how delusion happens is the key point of being a Dzogchen practitioner. If you don't, that's why we have this teaching called Tekchot, which is poorly translated out of English as cutting through.
Mm.
But actually, and it's one of the terms I don't translate out of Tibetan into English, because there's two different lineage explanations. One lineage explanation is that tek refers to something which is hard, and ch they take to be an active verb, meaning to cut. Unfortunately, for that particular explanation, the verb is actually for ch, which does mean to cut, and it's sort of it's a transient verb. It means to cut, but actually it's in the intransient verb form, and it's actually also a separate verb from. So they sound exactly the same to our ear. Ch. Ch. It's not ch like cutting, like the sort of famous, the sort of Tibetan sadhu tradition of people blowing thigh bone trumpets and with these big drums. Ch here means to fall apart or to become undone. There's no agent. There's no agent here. And the word tek in colloquial Tibetan refers to a bundle. And so a tek ching is a bundle of wood which is tied by a cord. So in one particular, in a couple of different places, we have the example, the metaphor for tek chode is like a sheaf of wheat. And if you've ever been in like the Himalayas or Tibet, when they're done, when they harvested the grain, they tie everything up to stand up so that the grain head's dry.
Right.
And they tie it, and so here the whole point is the idea is that this bundle has come undone.
Yeah.
And that's the real meaning.
If you were to, and I understand this is not exactly the metaphor, but if you were to cut the string holding the bundle, it would just fall apart and not be a bundle anymore.
Right. And so the point is that there's no agent.
Yeah.
So there can't be any cutting.
Yeah.
That's the point. An intransitive verb has no agent. And so therefore, no one's cutting the bundle. The bundle is just falling apart. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning that is that we have we say the tek chode, this teaching of tek chode, is related to understanding the nature of the basis. Now, earlier you said that in Krama, they basically start out from the point of view that there's an essence which cannot be defined. It's this mahashunyata, you basically described it as. You have this essence which cannot be ascertained in any way because it's beyond extremes. So that means it's not subject to intellectual analysis. It's questionable in my mind if you can even actually call it an experience, in fact. But in any case, so we have this basis, and the basis in Dzogchen is divided up into three related concepts. We have this essence, which is original purity, which stands in for emptiness. You have the nature, which I'm pretty sure is the Dzogchen shot across the bow at other Buddhists, meaning Prakriti in this case, rather than. So in Tibetan, just so you know, they originally when they were translating Madhyamaka, they translated the Swabhava as Ngooni. But then later, in the 11th century, they changed the translation from Ngooni to Swabhava to Rangjin. So there, you have to be aware of this. So anyway, so we have Ngo, which is basically emptiness.
And what are the difference? What's the semantic difference between those two terms that are translating Swabhava?
So Ngooni means the entity itself. Rangjin means resembling itself. Literally. Like itself.
Interesting.
So, more like intrinsic.
Yeah. Okay.
So a jin just means like your face. This is your face, is jin. Also, the ngo and ngo means your face. So they are related, but for whatever reason, later Madhyamaka translators decided that they liked Rangjin for Swabhava more than they liked Ngo Need for Swabhava, which caused all kinds of other problems, particularly in understanding the refutation of Sankhya that Nagarjuna was making in the 15th chapter of the Mula Madhyamaka Karikas, but that's a whole different issue. Anyway, the main point here is that we have Ngo, which is emptiness, you have which corresponds to Dharmakaya. You have Rangjin, which is clarity, which corresponds to the Sambhogakaya. And clarity here doesn't mean luminosity, but instead it refers to sort of the dimension of the mind in which appearances happen. And then you have this term which gets translated all kinds of different ways. The Tibetan term is tuje, which literally means compassion, and you have a lot of translators trying to deal with this term because what corresponds to tuje is the word in Tibetan sel, and sel is can be a translation of Shakti, like its potentiality. And you have emptiness and clarity, and these two combine. When these two, so by themselves, they are just generic characteristics. In combination, the nature, the essence and the nature, in the inseparability of the nature and nature is the instantiation of one's consciousness. And that's what Rikpa is. Rikpa, or Vidya, that is actually the instantiation of the union of emptiness and clarity. And when it has its potentiality, that it has its Shakti, which we're calling compassion. And the reason why it's called compassion is because it's the object of a yogi. It's what the yogi practices when they're on the path. It's also the basis for the activity of Buddhahood when you've completely realized Buddhahood. Hence, it's called compassion.
Yeah, and the when you speak of emptiness and clarity, the union of the two, you're talking about a union so complete that they cannot be distinguished from each other, right?
Exactly. More importantly, we also, I forgot to mention an important term, that this prakriti, this ranjan, this prakriti is also lundup. And lundup is a word in Tibetan which is it's a translation of nirabhoga or anabhoga, meaning effortless. And in Tibetan, though, it has the connotation of if you look this word up in a Tibetan dictionary, you will see that lundup means not made by anyone. So the whole point of the Dzogchen, this basis isn't made by anyone. There's no beginning.
Yeah.
It's standard Buddhist beginninglessness. Even though there's a cosmology which explains how Buddhas and sentient beings come about, it's understood that this is still a beginningless process of expansion and contraction, both on a cosmic level, on a personal level in terms of lifetimes, daily level in terms of cycles of waking and sleep, even a respiratory level and a cellular level. That all of what we experience is the basis constantly arising out of the basis. But that basis is more like Sankhya than it is like Advaita Vedanta. So Advaita Vedanta would argue that the basis is generic and uniform, is uniform, ontologically existent, and everybody has the same basis because this is Nirvikalpa Brahman. Dzogchen is much more similar to Sankhya in the fact that Sankhya argues that apart from this one special type of Purush called Ishwara, which at least according to Ramaswamy is special only insofar as that Ishwara was the first person that recognized their own nature and woke up. It's a little similar to Dzogchen in that respect. There are infinite numbers of Purushas which are independent and unique and exist. Where Dzogchen, and this is one point where there's a similarity between Buddhism and a difference between and Sankhya, and a difference between Buddhism and Sankhya. The problem with Sankhya from a Buddhist point of view is that they suggest that this Purush is something which is permanent. And also they suggest that Prakrit is also permanent.
Yeah.
It evolves. It's impermanent in the sense of its attributes through the three gunas are constantly changing, but it is a permanent substance, and those attributional changes are only a function of Purush not recognizing Pradhan for being what it is. And once Purush recognizes Pradhan for being what it is, then it ceases to experience the evolutes of Prakrit or Pradhan.
Yeah, it's disentangled.
It's disentangled, which means effectively now there's no more, regardless of what other people's evolutes are doing. And so Ramaswamy said, it's very funny. He said, well, if you achieve Kaivalya, then basically you're just going to go sit in your apartment, you're going to breathe, and you're going to eat, and you're going to wait to die.
Yeah, and be happy about it.
Be happy about it. And this one woman, she spoke up in the class and she said, but what about my boyfriend?
You're not ready for this teaching. Go away.
She was concerned. Yeah, so anyway, the difference, of course, is that in Dzogchen, we don't believe this Purush at all. We don't believe that there's something permanent. And we don't believe that Prakriti is really something permanent. But we do believe that there are multiple instantiations of mind streams. And so, we accept, for example, Vasubandhu's argument for multiplicity of mind streams. There are a number of things that in Dzogchen would vitiate against people conflating Dzogchen and its non-dual rhetoric with the non-dual rhetoric of other systems, particularly Advaita, and as I understand it, Trika, as it's been presented by Lakshmaniju, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Well, there's a there's a lot that we could explore here. Just want to mention, huh?
I said another conversation for another day.
Well, meaning to say, there's so many avenues, right? But I just want to mention, like, you characterized the krama as, imputing an essence, or teaching that there is an essence, meaning.
No, I didn't. What I meant to say is that we use this terminology in Dzogchen a lot. Madhyamaka, which says the essenceless essence.
Right. Yeah. Okay, good.
That we're saying essence because we're saying the essence of everything is empty. We can say that the essence of everything is empty. No problem. Chandrakirti says that. So when I say that, I'm saying what I was trying to say is that, as I understood you to describe Krama's sort of philosophical position, not that they really have one, but this essence is Tadang Dralwa. It is emptiness, and it is Dharmakaya, meaning this is Dharmakaya of the basis is what should be realized by the person. Because we have this emptiness as the fundamental nature of not only phenomenon, but of persons.
Yeah.
The realization of this fundamental emptiness, which is beyond any conceptual or ontological extreme, we're saying this is the Dharmakaya of the basis. So we say in Dzogchen, we say the three kayas, the three bodies of Buddhahood, are actually the real state of sentient beings.
Absolutely.
The real state of sentient beings is that they abide already in a state of liberation. This is the key difference between Dzogchen and other Buddhist traditions. Other Buddhist traditions regard human beings as being contaminated by something which needs to be removed. Dzogchen addresses the issue and addresses the the word I'm looking for. It addresses this sort of this. It addresses this kind of this issue of the need to be free of affliction. It's not. That's not the word I'm looking for. Anyway, having a 63-year-old moment here. But anyway, the main point is that the fundamental point of view of Buddhism is that we need to deal with these afflictive states. Dzogchen says we need to understand how these afflictive states evolve. At the end, it also says that these afflictive states aren't real, but nevertheless, we have to understand how they happen. Because to the extent that we allow ourselves to be deluded, we operate out of these afflictions, even though in their own right, from their own point of view, these afflictions are perfectly fine. But to the extent that we have misery, suffering, karma, rebirth, and so on and so forth, we also have to take this into account. This also has to do with how it is that, because Dzogchen, like all Buddhist tantric traditions, is a liberation in terms of a path based on the human body. Then we have to understand, because we have a different channel system that we use in Dzogchen, other than like the sort of a standard channel system that you're going to find in He Vajra, Chakrasamvara, etc. But my point about this, and I kind of got off my track, we have this teaching of Tekchod, which is how to recognize the basis, how to be in this knowledge of the nature of mind, how to sort of recognize, how to rest in a state of contemplation, where, at least for a brief moment, we are resting in a moment of what we call unfabricated. There are two terms we use. One is basically a sort of a Machopashepake Chikma, a moment of unfabricated a moment of unfabricated consciousness. Or my teacher uses the term Ke Chikma Rikpa, meaning instant, like an instant of vidya, an instant of cognizance, if you will. And this is another point that a lot of people don't understand, is that there's, in Dzogchen teachings, we use this term Rikpa, vidya. In Tibetan and Sanskrit, Rikpa has something to do with seeing. So, and it also is to know, both. Just like, so the two terms are very close in terms of their meaning. And we also need to understand that in Dzogchen texts, and this is why it can be hard to work with this term Rikpa, in Dzogchen texts, depending upon the context, either Dzogchen refers to a kind of a knowledge of your real nature. There's I'm probably going to get this wrong because I'm not a Sanskritist, but there's a term which is very widespread in Buddhist texts called prati atmya vedana jnana. Or some other kind of thing. And so you see sometimes the term prati atmya vit without the jnana. What it basically means, at least in Buddhist texts, I don't know how a Sanskritist would deal with this who's in a Hindu tradition, but prati atmya means personal, one's own. Vit means knowledge in this case. And jnana means gnosis. So it means the gnosis that one has personally discovered or personally, that's how Capstein translates it. He translates it as the gnosis that one has personally intuited. This term goes all the way back to the Buddha. You know, it basically refers to a yogi's knowledge of their real nature. And it's in every single Buddhist text, all the way up to Dzogchen. It's only in Dzogchen, the term Rikpa is a shorthand for this term.
Yeah. That's interesting.
So it means, so basically sometimes you see Rikpa also being treated as a character of the basis. So what I mentioned before is that we have compassion is the instantiation of our consciousness. But it's an individual instantiation. Why? Because we all individually suffer and achieve liberation. So we don't have this idea that there's some universal liberation of Samantabhadra that everybody enters into and we're all at the same time. It's clearly not the case, because the soul liberation, if you look at the sort of the evolution of the basis as it's described in Dzogchen text, you have one moment where Samantabhadra recognizes the appearances of consciousness as being their own state. That is, these five lights. We talk about this, we talk about the three pristine consciousnesses of the basis, we have to say pristine consciousnesses here because in a way it almost seems like Dzogchen is a kind of an idealism, where it's not really an idealism, but it seems that way. Whereas you have Rikpa, and then you have Vidya, and then you have Jnana. And Jnana is treated as an object, and Rikpa is treated as the subject. But they're non-dual. They're inseparable. You can never separate Rikpa and Jnana. And the original state of our consciousness is Jnana. And and when it's not recognized, when we are in a state of avidya, then that jnana is not recognized, and then we have vijnana.
Yeah. They are as inseparable as fire and its capacity to burn.
Pretty much heat. Yep, exactly.
Yeah, fire and its heat. This is the metaphor we get in the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra. Yeah, absolutely, because it's not a subject-object duality at all.
Right.
Yeah.
And so what happens is that we don't reject outer objects. Outer objects are fine. And the Longchenpa totally makes fun of people who reject outer objects as being fools who have no idea what they're talking about. So therefore, the question comes then is that when we talk about non-duality in Dzogchen, when we talk about the basis, so there's an interesting argument in the Rikpa Rangshar, the self-arisen Vidya Tantra, where basically he's arguing against somebody who's arguing for non-duality. And the argument is that at the time when the basis has arisen, when there's no consciousness, like when their consciousness is in a latent form and there's no perception whatsoever, it's fine to say at that time that the basis is non-dual. But the minute there is a perception of Buddhas and sentient beings. At that point, the whole argument of non-duality goes right out the window. Meaning that from a Dzogchen point of view, non-duality, it's fine to talk about non-duality as a cognitive experience, but you can't talk about it as an ontological state that applies to all phenomenon everywhere.
Absolutely. And this is an important point because a lot of people misunderstand Abhinavagupta as being a non-dualist, and and those others in his lineage, like Kshemaraja, but that's not the case because Abhinavagupta very clearly, in the original Sanskrit, he very clearly teaches what he calls supreme non-duality, which includes duality within itself as a valid aspect of that which exists. So he says our non-duality is not the non-duality of the Advaita Vedantins, because their non-duality negates duality. And our higher non-duality includes dualistic modes of consciousness and dualism, ontological dualism, and non-dualistic modes of consciousness and ontological non-dualism. That's all included within this more all-encompassing Paramadvaya, right? Which this non-duality, which includes within itself normal non-duality and duality and more as well.
I see. Dzogchen, I don't think would accept this Paramadvaya just simply because it's an ontological proposition, facially.
It can be taken that way. Whether it actually is that, I don't know. I'm not enough of a philosopher, but it's at least closer to the Dzogchen position than the position that people impute to Abhinavagupta.
Simply put, in Dzogchen, when we say that non-dual, we're just referring to the fact that we have this basis that we discussed. It has what we call 5 lights. So you have the 3 kayas of the basis, which people should be familiar with: Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, and Nirmanakaya, which are pretty much Dharmakaya realize is basically is what is to be realized. And also another important point about the basis that people see, you see Dzogchen translators all the time deviating into German phenomenology by using this term ground. When you see ground, you think that something is going to come from that ground.
Or that it has substance.
Yes, and not only that, but the point is that the term basis, ji, and in Sanskrit at least, one Dzogchen's master, he equates the term ji with the Sanskrit stan, standpoint.
Yeah.
Foundation, not a ground that things grow out of. And so he says basically Dzogchen's divided up into 3 phases. There's stan, marga, phala. Whereas, like for example, you look at Alan Wallace, and Alice Wallace, he mistakes ji as being ashreya, which isn't a terrible mistake, but it's not actually what the tradition states that stan is.
Yeah, substrate. Yeah.
Yes, that's why he uses the term substrate.
Yeah.
All over his translations. He's mistaken, unfortunately, in this regard. So anyway, the point is that also in Dzogchen, the basis refers to something that we haven't realized the nature of.
Yeah.
So we have also, like in normative teachings, we also have this term basis, path, and result actually comes from what we call the Guhya Samaj Uttara Tantra. There's a very famous passage that everybody uses. But in any case, here the main point is that the basis is something we haven't realized. The path of Dzogchen is to realize the nature of that basis, is to practice understanding the nature of what that basis is. The result is just realizing that we've never left that basis, that our basis is our real nature, and then we just need to remove are cognitive obscurations to understanding what our real nature is from the very beginning. So there's no reason to transform or change anything. We don't need a creation stage. Actually, really, honestly, the only thing a Dzogchen practitioner really needs, they need direct introduction. They need some kind of means to have this knowledge pointed out to them.
Yeah.
And then they need to have confidence in this. And so then the confidence in arriving at the basic confidence we have in sort of understanding the nature of our mind and the nature of our consciousness and so on and so forth, that is pretty much what the teaching of Tekchot is all about. Then the second part of the Dzogchen path is what we call Togal. And Togal really is, this is where all of this sort of pyrotechnics, which discussion of like channels and chakras and things, and it has very much to do with the kind of, I don't know, the theory of optics of Dzogchen has much more to do with Goethe than it does with Newton. Because the theory of optics in Dzogchen is that your eyes project somehow light. And the theory of Dzogchen in this respect is that what we normally consider to be what we call the Gyui Tigle, sort of the Hetu Bindu, if you will, in Sanskrit, which is the combination of the Sukra and Rakta of the mother and father, plus the 5 Vayus, the 5 elemental Vayus, are all together in a bindu in the center of the body. From a relative point of view, this is a compounded phenomenon. From an ultimate point of view, this is the basis of what we call the 4 visions, the sort of visionary thing that everybody's obsessed with when they hear about Dzogchen and how you go about achieving rainbow light. And so somebody in one text, somebody asked Padmasambhavi, says, well, before you said that this Gyui Tigle is compounded, and now you're saying that there's the Rikpa Tigle, the Bindu, maybe we should say Vidya Tilaka as opposed to Vidya Bindu, because this word Tilaka and Bindu are mistaken for each other frequently in Dzogchen teachings. In the Tibetan, it's the same word. It's Tilaka. Tigle. It's Tigle.
Yeah. That's interesting.
But it's used to translate both Bindu when we're talking about inside the body and round little spheres. But when we're talking about potentiality, when we're talking about sort of, then it's like we talk about this Tigleg Nyakchik, which there's a Sanskrit title which backs me up. There's a Tantra called the Ekatila, meaning, so Tigleg Nyakchik just means one, and it's a reference to the mind and how the mind itself includes the totality of all of our experience. And it's said that this this ekatila is non-dual. All of our experience in our mind is non-dual, of course, because it's just one. All of our experience includes everything that we experience. So of course it's non-dual.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that there isn't out there, a tree. But my experience of the tree and the tree, these are not the same thing. There's no identity proposition between my experience of the tree I'm seeing outside my window and the tree that's out there. It has its own dimension. We're happy. We don't mind that in Dzogchen. We're quite happy with that. Because we're not trying to understand trees.
Yeah. But if that is understood, the non-identity of your experience of tree and tree, then how could it be supposed that you could ever know anything about tree separate from your experience of it, or does Dzogchen not go there?
I mean, it's not a philosophically interesting question for liberation.
That's true.
Okay, so this is the point. Dzogchen says, and I'm getting to the real key point that distinguishes Dzogchen from other Buddhist systems and indeed other Hindu systems, as far as I understand them. We would say the darshans, the orthodox darshans.
Mm-hmm.
That's kinder, actually, than always saying Hindu. Because Dzogchen does address refuting the sort of orthodox darshans one by one, in ways that some people who are following them would probably find a little offensive, but you know how it is with polemical literature.
Yeah, of course.
You
But
know,
you're
like
coming
for
to
example,
the key point that distinguishes Dzogchen.
so for example, there's that famous ritual that some yogis, some sadhus do in India, where they have the five fires, right? They sit in the middle of four fires, and they have the sun above.
Yeah, Panchagni sadhana. Yeah.
Okay, so Panchagni sadhana in the Rigpa Rangshar Tantra is said that these yogis who do Panchagni sadhana, they have a dim memory from many, many past lives of having meditated on the five Buddha families. But since they don't recognize the five Buddha families in reality, then they don't understand that the sun is Vairochana, and then the four directional fires, Vajrasattva, Ratnasambhava, Amitabha, and Amoga Siddhi.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so they say that because of this, because they didn't understand this, then they do this. They're trying to get to the same point, but they're mistaken because this trace is very strong, but they don't understand the main point.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a funny thing. It also shows that the people who set down these Dzogchen tantras were at least aware of Indians and what they were doing. So the point of all of this discussion of like lights, so we don't recognize our own nature, this which has never been created from the very beginning. We fall into delusion because we become attached to the five lights of pristine consciousness, which we reify as the five vayus and the five elements, and then into the 25 elements, and so on and so forth. All this stuff, we take birth in a womb, and so on and so forth. Padmasambhava says, of course, that all these compounded phenomenon are actually uncompounded because our experience of the five elements just is due to our not recognizing the nature of the five elements as the five lights of pristine consciousness, or the five lights of jnana. Jnana Pancha Prabhas, I guess it would be something like that in Sanskrit. I don't know. But anyway, the whole point is that the path of Dzogchen is based on direct perception. Direct perception of what? Direct perception of this Tigle of Rigpa that exists in the center of your body, whose light can be projected based on certain secondary conditions through the eyes. And then you work with integrating with this light and resolving all of the karmic traces that are on your internal five elements, the vayus most specifically, but also your coarse five elements. This is how you get rainbow body. If you don't want to do that, if you're lazy and you don't want to sit there doing this kind of gazing, then you can just practice teksha, because the same luminosity manifests. Only in this case, what happens is that you begin to understand that this luminosity is what is behind all of everything in your perceptual field. And you realize that all of this, your perceptual field, is just empty clarity, which is powered by this energy of your consciousness. And then you just rest in that state. And also you can get another result, which is called atomic body, where your body basically disintegrates into its atomic particles.
So let me ask you, this direct perception of Rigpa Tigle is that, I assume that means a kind of profound and veridical gnosis of
the
Rigpa as what you are. It's not perceiving it as some sort of an object, right?
Oh yes, it's perceiving it as an object of the five senses. That's why we call it dharmata pratyaksha.
Okay, so you mean you have an experience of directly perceiving, as if it was an object, the Tigle that is the essence point of Rigpa.
What it means, and this is the big secret of Dzogchen. What it means is that you have this imagine you have a movie camera, a projector. You have a projector, right? Mm-hmm. You're in a movie theater.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You imagine that the Tigle of Rigpa is you imagine that the sky is this movie screen. You imagine that the eyes are the lens.
Yeah.
You imagine that there's this light of Rigpa in the center of your body, which is projecting this light through these channels. And so they use this term. They say it's very important to make a distinction between the representation, which is out here, and the basis, which is here.
Okay, now I get you. Yeah.
So with this direct perception is why Dzogchen says that all the other vehicles no matter what they are, since they do not have this experience, they don't even discuss it. No other system in the world says you can directly experience your jnana as a visual object with your eyes and achieve liberation in that way. I've never encountered it in any other system.
Yeah.
Now, I could be wrong. There could be other systems that say the same thing, but this is the key point that Dzogchen identifies itself as being the what distinguishes itself from all Buddhist and non-Buddhist vehicles.
Yeah. Okay, this is interesting. And this Rigpa Tigle, or what we would call in Shaivism awareness bindu in the center of the body, in the center of the chest, is distinct from the white bindu in the head and the red bindu in the base.
It's actually made up of the father, mothers. I told you before, so that the Hetu Bindu and the Vidya Tilaka are actually the same thing.
Okay.
The difference is, so Dzogchen also completely rejects the distinction between Dharmin and Dharmata.
Okay.
It completely rejects the distinction between compounded and uncompounded. And it completely rejects the distinction between Paramart and Samvirti Satyas.
So does that mean that the Rigpa Tigle in the center is not compounded of the white bindu in the head and the red bindu in the base?
They're different. They are. So if you're talking about Tumo, this is based on another tantric theory in Buddhism, right? The idea is that the father's Tigle travels here, a bit of it, and then the mother's Tigle travels here, where it's right below the navel, 4 fingers, which is the basis for Tumo and the Kundalini and etc.
Yeah.
So that's there, but at the same time, there's also what's known as in Sanskrit we say Anahata Bindu, which is in the heart center.
Yeah, yeah.
And that we call that the Mishik Tigle in Tibetan, because the Tibetans understood Anahata as indestructible rather than unstruck.
Yeah, and there are some Trika teachings that present exactly the same formulation of this. So
the Anahata Bindu, Anahata Bindu is also made up of the father's element, the mother's element, plus the 5 vayus that come. So in Dzogchen, this is why embryology is so important in Dzogchen, because you're a Gandharva. You're trying to take rebirth somewhere. So your Alaya Vijnana is mounted on what's called the Maha Prana Vayu. You're floating around in the bardo. You see people fucking. You enter through their ass. Then all of this comes together in the womb, and then you have the zygote, the embryo. And so you have 5 elements from the mother, 5 elements from the father, which is relative elements, and then you have another 5 elements which come from the Vayu, the Chitta Vayu complex.
Yeah.
So the relative elements provide the basis for the development of the human body, and the ultimate elements, which come from the mind, the Chitta Vayu, they are what provide the basis for the anatomy, which allows you to have this realization at all.
Yeah.
And so that's why embryology is so important in Dzogchen teachings. But you see, the thing is, seeing these visions is exactly the same thing that caused you to become deluded to begin with. Because when we're at the time of the basis and the basis is appearing out of the basis, that is, we're waking up, we actually know now that we're a conscious being. And then we experience our cognitive panorama, and we experience it as other, and then or self and other, however it happens. So it can happen in a couple of different ways. At that moment, we enter into samsara immediately. But if we're Samantabhadra, we recognize this cognitive panorama as being our own state, because in a previous eon, we already achieved Buddhahood. So what most people don't realize is that Dzogchen isn't explaining how all of a sudden, boom, out of the beginning, there was a Buddha that was a primordial Buddha. Primordial here, just in Dzogchen terms, just means that at the beginning of this particular eon, someone who realized Buddhahood in the last eon, when everything became active again, when all of the vayus started stirring up the cosmos again, all the impure karma, this person who realized Buddhahood in the previous eon recognized their own state and woke up again. Because also, this is another key point, an interesting point of Dzogchen. Some of the reasons why we fell back into samsara is because some realization of some Buddhas is incomplete and they screw up. There's kind of like bringing up this like notion of arhats who can fall back. There's also some Buddhas who can fall back. And the implication is that these are Buddhas who practiced other paths other than Dzogchen.
Okay.
So it's very triumphalist.
Well, they all are, aren't they? But some have more justification for their triumphalism than others.
Yeah. But I mean, it's very important. So it's very important to understand that these two things are like, that's why we say that textual is the basis, because it's related to understanding, it's really related to understanding how delusion happens.
Yeah.
Once you understand how delusion happens and you can rest in that moment of undiluted, unfabricated consciousness, then you can start working with what we call the visions. But working with the visions isn't necessary for liberation. The thing that's mostly necessary for liberation is understanding how delusion happened. And once you understand that and you're comfortable with that, then you're free. You can relax, because what Dzogchen teaches, I'm sure there's Hindu teachings that are whatever tantric, non-Buddhist tantric teaching to say whoever enters this door is guaranteed liberation. So Dzogchen Tantra say the same thing. Whoever enters the door of Dzogchen teachings, guaranteed you will never take rebirth in the three realms again.
Yeah. So there's so much here and so many interesting parallels with some specialized aspects of Krama and Shrika Tantra that I don't have time to get into because I have to wrap it up here. But I just wanted to touch briefly, super briefly, on a couple things. Like, when the Krama tradition describes the nature of Kali, they describe it in terms, interestingly, very similar to Dharmakaya and Sambhogakaya, and Dharmakaya as the ultimate basis, right? It's the same in the Krama, where the basis is, of course, not separate from that in all the phenomena which are based on it, right? Kali in this ultimate form, which is again not anthropomorphic, not depictable in any way. She's said to be formless, yet having the form of all three worlds, beyond any ideation or constructs concerning existent and non-existent, prior to all limitations in her primordial uninflected nature, and yet she appears as all inflections. She appears as all embodiments. So it's like it's so similar, apart from the use of a feminine personal pronoun that implies theism, but it's not really a theistic system in any normal sense of the term. So I'm seeing some parallels there that we'll have to have another conversation to get more precise.
Well, the fact of the matter is that nobody who's really qualified to talk about these things in English, about Dzogchen teachings, has been communicating with people who are qualified to talk about these things in these sort of non-Buddhist tantric things in English, and there's a lot of misunderstanding, both within the Dzogchen tradition. And like I know friends who think that like Ramana Maharshi was a Dzogchen master, and I read Ramana Maharshi and I just don't see it.
No. He was great, but not a Dzogchen master. Finally,
Sure.
This term unfabricated, this is such an important term in Krama materials too. Akritrima in Sanskrit, which means unconstructed, unfabricated, non-artificial.
Yep.
Right.
Pretty much. I think if I looked at Machup, you would find something a little similar in sort of Tibet. I use a lot, so I don't know Sanskrit well, but I know a lot of Sanskrit words. I just don't know Sanskrit grammar. So
Yeah,
I
yeah.
often triangulate in my translation. I have the Tibetan term, and I look in like various sort of equivalents, sort of dictionaries, and see like what the Sanskrit term might be. If I can find it, that's great. If I can't, that's okay too. Because you can't translate Tibetan text without taking into consideration the profound amount of influence Indian Buddhism has on all Tibetan everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
And at the same time, Tibetan Dzogchen texts, they have their own very unique Tibetan flavor.
Yeah. Yeah. But there's this interesting parallel with the great significance of kind of reposing in these unconstructed, unfabricated states of consciousness, for lack of a better phrase.
Sure. One of the things that drives me crazy is when people say that Dzogchen is a formless meditation, and that is analambana. They say
Yeah, well, I think you've explained in this very conversation how that's a misunderstanding.
Longchenpa himself negates this term. In Tibetan, we say mikba and mikme, so alambana and analambana. And so all these people talk, oh, Dzogchen is just a formless kind of meditation. It's actually completely not that whatsoever. It's
Yeah,
not even. It's not even really a meditation, because meditation requires that one important distinction that maybe I'll just briefly mention before we go. This notion we call in Tibetan we call Rangjin Samten, as opposed to some dhyana in sessions. And Longchenpa says that Rangjin Samten, dhyana, natural dhyana, isn't something which is broken up into sessions, because if you do standard meditation, you sit down, you do meditation. When you break the posture, your dhyana is also broken. In Dzogchen, it's about discovering natural concentration, Rangjin Dhyan, so
yeah,
that no matter whether you're meditating or you're not meditating, the knowledge that the knowledge that you've discovered is never broken.
yeah,
It's always constant. It's always there.
yeah,
That's why they call it natural, because it's never broken. And so it doesn't matter whether you've sat down to practice or you're cooking dinner or whatever you're doing.
yeah, yeah. Once it's realized.
Yeah, and that
Yeah,
realization doesn't mean you're a Buddha. That realization means you've just discovered something of your own nature.
exactly. Beautiful.
Okay.
And the final point I wanted to highlight is this brilliant explanation you gave of trekchod, right? Of that most people translate cutting through, as you said, because this also has a parallel in the krama. You said, like, this better understanding of trekchod is like falling apart or unraveling. And if I understood it correctly, you'll tell me, it is parallel to this krama teaching where, when you see through the illusory construct of your own independent selfhood, then you realize it was the belief in selfhood that was binding this
Mhm.
together, more or less, and that without that belief, the experience of yourself as a separate self just falls apart. And then what's left, of course, is the perception of a flux of phenomena where any dividing line, this is me and that's not me, any dividing line that's drawn is ultimately arbitrary, and that the
Mhm.
flux of phenomena, it cannot is ultimately indivisible, right? And so there's this falling apart, this beautiful falling apart of individuated selfhood, and there's not even any talk of then you become one with everything, right? Because there's not someone left who becomes one with everything,
There
right?
also is there also isn't any one.
Yeah,
No, there's no one out there to become something part of.
right. But you do experience in indivisibleness.
We use this term. We use the term diversity. Then you're just left just resting in diversity.
Yes, a total diversity of phenomena, which none of which are divisible from any other, right? Because it's all interacting. It's all obviously completely.
Within the tilaka of your own experience,
Yeah.
it's indivisible.
Okay.
But at the same point, we also are free to experience trees as trees. and we have direct perception of objects as objects in their actual nature, because we know that the nature of a tree, lacking any identity whatsoever, being actually just an arbitrary designation, we know that we're going to experience diversity, but we're going to know that there's in diversity there's no one and there's no many. I'm sure that language is very similar, but there's no kind of like, now we're going to experience something else. All we experience is just diverse appearances that we recognize, that in our own experience we recognize as just being the expression of the Shakti, if you will, of our own consciousness. And at the same time, we understand that all of this out there is also there. And because Dzogchen, of course, is grounded in Buddhism, we understand that everything that Longchenpa addresses, he said, everything out there just exists by virtue of the sort of 8 examples of illusion that you'd be familiar with from the Mula Madhyamaka Karika.
Yeah.
So it's all just dependently originated. It all has its own dependent origination. We don't concern ourselves with it. We just enjoy the variety and rest in that.
Beautiful. Great. So I'm glad that I more or less understood how you were explaining Trekchod, and I'd love to hear more about that sometime.
Norbert Bichet, he translated Trekchod as releasing tension. But falling apart, that's perfect. Even before you said falling apart, I thought the word falling apart. So, we were on the same page there.
Wonderful. Well, I wish we had more time, but thank you for this conversation. Sure. And
anytime you want to chat, just send me a link. And I'm affable, and I like to talk about Dzogchen teachings and learn a little bit about things I don't know, like Krama. I had no idea about it.
Yeah.
Not surprising. Well, you translate obscure texts that no one has access to, and I translate obscure texts that no one has access to. So that makes us, that puts us, in a unique category.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm coming out, next year sometime with a book on the Krama, which you might be interested in, but you're coming out with a book much sooner, I think.
Well, there's the Yoga of the Natural State, and right now I'm working on the Sound Tantra, which is between the Root Tantra and the commentary is going to be more than 1,000 pages.
Wow.
That's me and my translation partner.
Okay, we'll put a link so people can check out the books you've already published, and wonderful.
Yeah, we have published 4 of the most important. Well, we're the 17 tantras is the most important set of tantras in Dzogchen. Not that there aren't others that are very important. And in December, a series of texts by Longchenpa, which represents the sort of the Karna Tantra, of Dzogchen, the Nyingyu, written down by Longchenpa, will be coming out then. So people will find that interesting.
Well, I've got to run to another meeting here in 4 minutes. Great to talk to you. Thanks for coming on, and we'll be in touch.
Okay. Take care, man.
Take care.
Hope you enjoyed the episode. Remember, you can always find out more about the tradition of non-dual Shaiva Tantra at tantrailluminated.org, where, if you wish, you can become a subscriber to our online learning portal, and you'll receive access to a vast number of recordings, including a comprehensive curriculum in tantric philosophy, tantric yoga practices, guided meditations, and much more. Music for the podcast composed and recorded by Ann Leader. Find her at annleader.com. Podcast produced by Paula Chamas. New episodes drop every other week. And may all beings benefit.